Hey guys, well we actually decided to name our house. So the name is Faewood, and we chose that name because of the white stag and how that in mythology signals the coming of the Fae folk. And then obviously we live in a forest, so Faewood. We found a local carpentry place that sold live edge pieces of wood. So you can see he was cutting up a piece of like a slab for us to use. And this is the piece of wood in the car. So before I got started, I actually decided to burn some sage incense to get rid of any bad juju, because I was having a bit of bad luck that day as well when I went to start this sign. So and also just to bless it for the house and everything, I had the sage incense going. Now I printed this off from the computer and I used paint, and in paint there's a tiling option for posters. I find this works better than say Photoshop, which also has a tiling option when you print. For some reason I can't get that one to work, but the one in paint I have no trouble with. So I tend to use Photoshop and move it into paint to print it. And you know, kept printing off versions till I was happy with the size of the text and everything. Now, because of the shape of the sign, I decided to cut it up, and you can see I'm positioning the F so that the bottom of it is lower than the rest of the text, and that's just purely so it fits nicely into that piece of wood. And I really wanted it to fill up the whole space of the sign. I also got this little bit of clip art. I bought this online for a couple of dollars. I can't remember where from, but if I find the link I'll put it down in the description. And I thought this was just a nice little addition, you know, on either side of the text, just to add a bit of interest. Now, it's a wobbly sign, so it's difficult to say what's straight and what's not, but I just made sure that the F and the writing was straight with each other, and that's why I had that bit of wood there, just working out if it is straight. And before I do any tracing, I wanted to make sure it wasn't going to move, so I just stuck it on with some sticky tape. And I used, I had greaseproof paper already, so I used that for doing the tracing. I think it would be a lot easier if you actually had proper tracing paper or carbon paper, because it's much easier to trace on, and it traces directly, you know, through when you do it. But if you don't have it, then this is a method that you can use. So first you obviously trace out everything onto the paper. Now, I think I actually used two different fonts for this. I can't remember, but the F, you know, was sort of an old English F, and then I think it was a different font for the rest of the writing there. I just played around with different fonts until I was happy with the way it looked. Now, of course, when I put it back on here, I want to make sure it's positioned where I want it, so that's why I'm drawing around the edge of the wood so that I've got a guideline of where it needs to sit when I actually trace it back onto the wood. So this part you don't have to be as careful with. You're really just putting the pencil on there so that it can be it's sort of a replacement for using a carbon paper, and you'll be sort of pressing this pencil back into the wood when we trace over it again. So you're just sort of trying to put a lot of pencil on there so that it's nice and dark and thick and everything. mean, you could virtually scribble this. You wouldn't even necessarily have to outline it. It really is to add that bit of, you know, carbon type stuff for you to trace on, that will leave an impression of the actual lines when you do it. So you can see now I've put it back the right way around and I've taped it in place, and I'm again tracing it out, and this is what's pushing that pencil that we just added onto the wood. Now it's going to be quite light, so you do need to sort of darken it up so that you can really see the outlines properly. So there's a fair bit of drawing and tracing and things to get the actual design onto the wood itself. That's why it might be better to have some carbon paper, so if you do have that, probably use that. Now I didn't have very good lines for everything there, so I was just referring to the F on the tracing paper just to get an idea of where the lines should be, because some of it didn't trace through as well. But you can see a very faint line that's come through, and it's enough for me to get a guideline, and then I'm just darkening that up so that I know exactly where the letters should be. Now, I wasn't sure how to carve this, and I had some lino tools, and yeah, you can see this would be a horrible, horrible job, and I would hate my life. So we decided to go and get a Dremel, and this is my husband here. We're both having a look to see if it'll work, and he has a little test run as well. So he helped with the sign, and then gave it back to me, because it was sort of, I guess, my baby, my project, something that I've wanted to do for quite some time. And we've thought about this name for the house for quite some time as well. So basically you need to hold it a little bit like a pencil, but I held it a little higher because it was less sore on my hands. But you need to move it quite quickly if you want a very minimal sanding and minimal line, and then obviously slower and in one place to go deeper. So I really started softly, and it can sort of get away from you, the Dremel, if you're not careful. The bit that I'm using on the end here was the one that it suggested for carving wood, and if you buy a kit, they usually tell you. There is an engraving bit you can use as well, but that's very small, so it would be good for very, very fine work, but you can see they've got some quite large bits to do, so the engraving tool would have taken a lot longer and not been as good. Now once I get the outline, I'm going back in as much as I can to really try and deepen up each section. I really want it quite carved out. We did think about using chisels and things as well, but I thought it might be a bit difficult, especially given all the curves and detail that we were wanting in here. And although it did take a while to get the depth with the Dremel, I really felt like this worked very well. It was a little tricky around corners and things, but I think it would have been a lot harder if we were trying to carve it with chisels. Of course, if you're very good with chisels, then you might go straight to the chisel instead of using a Dremel. Now there was some inclusions on this piece of wood which, you know, I loved the way they looked, but I had to be really careful with the text and make sure that was really deep so that you could really see where that was, and not have it entirely obscured by these darker patches through the wood. So I had to go very deep so that you could see that it was carved, and you could see the full shape of the letter. Now if you add a little bit of pressure to the Dremel, it does go nice and deep, so that's something that you can do. You don't want to add too much pressure because you don't want to break it, but you know, just holding it firmly pushes it into the wood a little bit more. Or if you're wanting to go lightly, I just kept it moving quite fast and touching lightly on the wood. It does kick up like a lot of sawdust, so I did this on the deck, not inside. Now I had a water-based finish that we've used on outdoor furniture before. This was called Sickens, is the brand, and it's sort of a honey brown colour stain and finish. And we tried that first. The idea was both of us wanted it to look very rustic, and we wanted to retain the look of the wood and not cover that all up with paint. So this was the first thing we tried. It turned out to be not quite dark enough though, so I did end up going over it again with acrylic paint. But if you've got a darker stain or something like this, then you could definitely use that. Or if your wood is a lighter colour so that you've got enough contrast, it might work out. But I don't think, it wasn't as readable, and it didn't look quite as good as, you know, it ended up looking when we put darker colour on it. Yeah, so the name that we came up with, we thought about for quite some time. As I mentioned, Faewood, the word Fae is short for fairy, if you're not familiar with that. And if you've watched my videos, you'll know that we saw a white stag on New Year's Day when we first moved into the house. And it was this really amazing moment to sit there and watch this, you know, really rare white stag that we knew was around the area but never expected to see, and on such an important day as well. In Celtic mythology, it's a really important symbol of great things to come, and pagans believe the white stag can foretell the coming of the Fae folk. And I really wanted to use something about the white stag in the title of the name of our house because it was such an important thing. And, you know, I thought this was definitely a house that deserves to have a name because it's such a special house. So amazing to us. We love it, so inspiring. And yeah, so we just thought about the name for a while, and after a few months, when we were still happy with the name, we decided to go ahead and make the sign. Now I chose a matte finish for this clear coat, and it's actually an internal one, it's Cabot's, but you know, look, I think that will be fine. It's actually undercover, so it should be okay. And we just hung it up at the front next to our front door, but there was those hooks there, so we had to remove those, and we used the bolts to hang it up. So you'll see the nice big chunky bolts that were holding up those hooks are now used to hold up the sign. And that darker colour that I've added, I really think worked so well. And I love that the sign looks just ancient, as if it's always been there. Well guys, I'd like to officially welcome you to Faewood. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.